Hi, I'm Steve Bonacontri from SOA Consulting Services, and this tutorial is going to talk about Angular 4 reactive forms. Reactive forms use the directives from the Reactive Forms module. It's a two-step process. First, you create the model programmatically. Then you link the HTML template to that model using directives. A model uses classes in the Angular Forms package to construct a model to be used as a data structure to store the form's data. A form control is an atomic form unit, that is, an input field. A form group is a collection of form controls. For example, suppose you want to group together a password and password confirmation. You would use a form group to group those two attributes together. A form array is a variable length form type. A form array could be used for a user to add additional input text fields, for example, and have the back-end data store dynamically grow in length. A form control can represent an HTML element, or it could be a more complex fragment. It stores the current value of the HTML element it corresponds to, the element's validity status, and whether it's been modified. For example, it can determine whether the data is dirty, pristine, valid, invalid, etc. For example, suppose we let pet name equal a new form control and initialize its value to timber. That would be a way to define a form control called pet name. In a template, I could use a directive to map an input field to that pet name in my component. A form group is a collection of form controls. It aggregates the values and status of each control. If one control is invalid, the entire group becomes invalid. To create a form group, you can actually do something like let form model equal new form group, and just specify a JSON object which has an attribute and its type. So for example, the from can be a form control and the to can be a form control, and both of those can be contained in a form group. And the form group is then viewed as the form model. The components template now has that model to try to map attributes to that form model using directives. A form array is a variable length form type. It's a collection of fields capable of growing arbitrarily. It controls associated with indices. For example, let form model equal new form group, and inside that form group we define phone numbers, which is a new form array. Form array is used to allow users to enter arbitrary number of phone numbers. So we add two form controls to that form array, but in reality the form array has a variable length, and we could add as many phone numbers to that form array that we like. And of course, once again, the form model is part of the component. The component's template has to use directives to associate fields in the form to the form model. In addition, it can actually map those attributes to something called phone numbers, which is the form array. Okay, reactive form directives come from the reactive forms module, and there's several of them. There's the form group. It binds a DOM element to an instance of the form group class. Form group name links DOM element in the template to variable name defined in the parent form group. A form control binds a single DOM element to an instance of a form control class. A form control name links DOM element in a template to name defined in the form control. And the form array name links a DOM element to an instance of a form array class. So basically anything that these directives that end in a name, you're basically associating something on the template to a name in the app component. Okay, for example, a form group binds an instance of forms group to the HTML form element. Inside its scope, a form control name can be used to link one of its child form control instances to a DOM element. So for example, suppose we had a component called user component, and in that user component we had a user model. The user model is type form group, and we instantiate a form group, and inside that form group we define something called username. Username is a form control type, and we instantiate a form control and assign it to username. When we develop our template, we define a form, and then we use the left square bracket form group to indicate what a form group is being mapped to. That is, this template is being mapped to the user model object in the app component. Then inside the form, we have an input tag. It's a text field, and we map it to username. The form control name specifies which attribute of the form group we're mapping the text field to. So it's rather simple, with the exception of the syntax, which is kind of confusing once your application gets large. But loosely speaking, a form is pointing to a form group, and you define which one it is in your component. Here, my form group with this form is being mapped to user model. And then the form control name allows me to point to the different attributes in my app component that my input controls are pointing to, let's say. Okay, form group name links a child form group. So suppose we had the class user component. We have a user model, which is a form group. We instantiate the form group, and we define the attributes of the form group. Username is a new form control, which is an attribute of my form. But then I define something called credential, and basically what I do is I create an embedded form group inside that form group. Why? Because I want to categorize the password field and the confirm password field. So those are two form controls inside my credentials form group. Now, I'm looking at credentials here, and I'm thinking namespaces, because my user model is a form group, and I use my user model to point to the form group, and I could use the control name to point to username. but I have to use form group name to point to the credentials form group. So looking at the HTML markup in the template, once again I use the left square bracket form group to point to which form group I'm using within this template. I'm using user model. User model has to be defined in the component which is associated with the template. Remember, we're talking about a component template here. It's not a component, not just a template, it's a component template. And they're working together. Angular is using both of them, and they're working together. In reality, the component manages the template, so it is a component. But think along those lines that you're working with two entities here. It's easier for me to think that way. Okay, now you have a div tag which has a username, an input field, and you have a form control name which points to username. And then we have a div tag which says form group name is credentials. This piece of my markup fragment is mapping to an embedded form group inside my user model form group. Password is an input field. That form name is pointing to password. The confirm input field form control name is defined to confirm. So basically what I've done in this template is I mapped the form to a form group called user model. I mapped username to a form control called username. I mapped a subform group of my forms called credentials to a form group credentials in the user component. And then I started mapping those attributes via the form control name attribute to the password and the confirm. Form control binds a single field to an instance of form control. The simplest way to use the Forms API without a form group and still get reactive behavior as well as validation is to use a form control. This example shows a class stock price component with a stock symbol with a simple form control. The constructor looks at the value changes property of the stock symbol. Now, a form control is part of the reactive forms module. So the form control implicitly uses observables. And so doing the dot value changes on the stock symbol streams the characters that the user is typing into an input field which is mapped to this form control. The dot to bounce time says stream all those elements, and after 700 milliseconds, give them to me. The dot switch map says for each one of those characters in that stream, give them to me as one group of characters and get the stock price for that particular symbol, which is represented by that group of characters. And then the subscribe maps the result of that price and logs it. Okay, so changes stream characters for 700 milliseconds using debounce time, and then result stream set use to call get stock price, and that result is sent to the subscriber. The switch map function, after 700 milliseconds, if necessary, will kill the web service. In other words, the dip bounds time is saying, give me the group of characters after 700 milliseconds. I'm going to call the web service. If that web service gets stock price, does not return before another 700 milliseconds elapses, the switch map will kill the web service, then call the web service again using the larger data set. So it's like this: 700 milliseconds, you get the chunk of characters, call the web service. Another 700 milliseconds, you get a larger chunk of characters, call the web service. The subscribe starts the whole process, but what you'll see is, as you're typing, the console is logging the price of a symbols, which are these chunks of characters that are growing as the user's typing. Okay, so you could use an input type text and a form control to map to the stock symbol attribute in the stock price component. So this syntax says this input field has a form control in the back app component, which is called stock symbol. Another way to say that, it binds the input DOM element to the stock symbol form control instance. Okay, the form array name links a child form array to a DOM element. So for example, we have a class user component with a phone model. It's a form group. I instantiate the form group and I add to the form group phone numbers, but I define it as a new form array with an array of controls. Phone numbers has variable length. When I add a phone number, I could say this phone model, get phone numbers, push a new phone control, and log the phone model value. In the form, I associate the form group with the left square bracket to the phone model in the user component. Then I use in a list. I use the form array name to point to the phone numbers inside the user component. This template fragment is being mapped to phone numbers in the user component. Now we use the directive ng4. We let E of phone model get phone numbers.control, and we define input markup fragments using that form control name. So basically this is going to add an input parameter to add a field to a form, and we're going to add a button here which adds an event to add a phone number. And so as we type in phone numbers in this field, we're adding more fields as we click, and adding more phone numbers to the backend model. So the add phone number pushes a new additional form control when the user clicks. Form Builder. Form Builder provides a simplified implementation of reactive forms by providing a structure that allows you to list variables and corresponding validators. So in my app component, in my constructor, I could use a form builder, get the group of that form builder, define it to be my form model, and I could group attributes of the form group and corresponding validators. So it's sort of like a configuration based, and it's a convenience to create your forms this way because it's less coding, it's configuration based, and it's very convenient to create a form which can in a flexible manner grow as you're coding and mapping your template values to your form model. Okay, validation. Validators use plain TypeScript functions. Template-driven or wrapped as directives. Reactive are plain functions. So validators implement the following interface using reactive forms. There's a function with a single parameter and a return an object literal. And this is a type declaration, which is an object literal. It has property names or strings, and values can be any type. And validators can be made for all model classes. We say that because there's a relationship that form groups and form controls and form arrays are all inherited from abstract control. So you can create validators for each and every one of them. Okay, so these predefined validators for basic types. So validator class, a static predefined method that corresponds to standard HTML attributes. You have required, min length, max length, pattern, etc. You could import the validators from Angular Forms. And then when you create a form control, let's say name or phone, you can define them to be required and also be required and let's say have minimum length 10. So we can call those built-in validators. You don't have to do any customization. You just use them. And then, in the form control, you could basically say, after the user has, let's say, submitted the form, in the app component, you could say, is this phone valid? Now, if it is valid, this value would be a JSON object. If it's not valid and it's an error, it would still be a JSON object, and you'd get something like the validator's name and the required length and the actual length. So basically, be prepared to interrogate a JSON object to determine what the status is. Okay, so if we let phone errors equal phone.errors, we'd specify the type to be this object literal, and we'd expect to see some values like in the example. Okay, so custom validators, we use standard functions. They're used for more complex types and application logic validations. You have input control types, and outputs are error objects. So for example, this is a function I'm customizing, which basically is a phone validator. It takes a form control. It looks at the value of the form control, makes sure if it's null, it defines it to be an empty string. And then it checks the value to make sure that it has certain numeric or left paren, right paren, or hyphen characters. And then it would return null if it was valid, and it would return an error object if it wasn't. So the error object phone true basically means you got an error on the phone, and you use this value to say you get back this valid, and if it's true, if it's not null, then phone is true. Then you could do something with the error handling. Okay, so when you instantiate the form control, you define it to be a new control, and it could start out as an empty string, but you have to add the phone validator so that it gets validated. And like I said in the previous slide, it's sort of like an all or nothing thing with the form. It's either a valid form or it's not a valid form. And if your form is just a control, it's the same thing. Okay, group validators. Validates form groups. Suppose we have a function equal validator. We basically can use that for a form group. So a form group would get passed into that equal validator. There's a destructuring feature in TypeScript which allows us to do the curly bracket value and get a handle on that value. Inside our function, basically we look at the keys of that value, and we map the first key to a variable called first, and the rest of the keys to a rest operator rest. So the rest of the keys go into the rest variable. Now what we do with the rest.every is we check every element in the rest variable to make sure the value is equal to the first. In this case here, rest has only another variable in it. If my form group is password and confirm password, really it's just a first and second variable, but we're showing you this example to demonstrate some of the features of TypeScript. Okay, then I return valid. If it's true, it returns a null, else it returns an error object. So I return a JSON object equal : true. Okay, then in the form model in my component, I instantiate a new form group. I create a password group, a new form group with a password, with a form control, let's say the validators.minLength 8, and the confirm new form control. And then in my form group, in the third argument, I add the equal validator, which is my custom validator. So when I create my form group for password group, I actually added an equal validator to that group. So notice my validator is for an embedded form group of my form model group. So I think what we've just shown is you could have validators for a single control. You could have validators for a form group. Okay, then is asynchronous validators, functions that typically validate forms against a remote server using HTTP and return an observable or a promise object. You could have a function and call it async phone validator, and basically it returns an observable, and we just simulate that by using this delay 7000 function, which is in the RxJX package, just to mimic an asynchronous validator. And just to point out that when you have a form control, suppose you have the form control and you instantiate, define it to be a new form control, the async validator is the third argument of the instantiation of form control. Spent many years avoiding client server-side validation, and I had a lot of managers try to get me to use it, and we eventually did. But this is a good application, a good way in Angular 4 to do a server-side validation service call using the async validator. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some code examples. We're going to look at the first example, which will use form group name. The next example will be an example of form array. We'll look at a form builder example, and we'll look at a validator, a custom validator example. So stay tuned for the next tutorial on reactive forms, where we go through all these examples in detail.